Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much if you're tuning in live or if you're going to watch the recording later. We're so excited to be in conversation with you today and to have this conversation in general. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Brittany Ramos de Barros. I use she pronouns, and I am running to fight for New York 11 in Congress because we deserve better, and we are building a movement of working class people that are rising up to demand what we know are the basic rights and dignity that we deserve as people who keep our communities moving, who are essential in so many ways, as we've seen even more and more through the last year. And I say that because I think that it's very connected to the struggle that people are having in my ancestral homeland of Puerto Rico, as well as diaspora Puerto Ricans all around the United States, and especially in New York City. And so it is my incredible honor and privilege to be here with Jose Alejandro LaLuz, who has been a lifelong activist and organizer, to talk about the issues facing Puerto Ricans today and about the struggle for self-determination and human rights is what we're really talking about. So, Jose, thank you so much for joining us. It's really an honor. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Brittany. I'm looking forward to this conversation, and I'm ready to get started.
All right, let's dig in. So, I'm so excited to jump in and talk about the issues because you are one of the most active and knowledgeable people I know on these issues. But before that, let's get to know you as a human. Tell us a little bit about your story, what growing up was like for you, and how that led you to the work that you do today.
So I was born, several decades ago. As you said, in our ancestral homeland, which is actually my homeland. I was born there, to a working class, family. At the time that the island was witnessing this transition from being essentially an underdeveloped, economy, a society facing numerous, challenges in terms of poverty and starvation, and I witnessed, firsthand a lot of that, and the transition from the interior of the island, from the farms, from the countryside, so to speak, to the urban areas, what became known as urbanizaciones, urban developments. My grandfather helped to build, was associated with the building of one of the very first developments, urban developments, known as Roosevelt, named after Eleanor Roosevelt, or Roosevelt, as our folks used to, call it or refer to it, in what is known as Hato Rey, which is part of, the greater San Juan metropolitan area, and where many families from different towns in the island, and particularly from the countryside, from farming communities, moved, and where we witnessed the emergence of a new working middle class, thanks to the application of the New Deal policies in Puerto Rico. There was a colonial governor appointed by the Roosevelt administration, who was a visionary progressive, Rexford Tocqueville. In the 40s, he was part of FDR's brain trust. He developed an alliance with this emerging populist leader called Luis Muñoz Marin, pushing of reforms very deep reforms, including land reform and urban development, and the creation of jobs for people with a new industry. So I lived through those stages of development of the island. I witnessed how many of the people that were known as the jibaros, right, the campesinos, in many of the small towns where my family comes from, one of those up in the mountains called Ciales. And so I was able to go to the public university, to the state university, thanks to the scholarships that were provided to many students. The tuition was, very, very low. It was, very accessible and affordable, because the point was to provide, higher learning education to the sons and daughters of the working class. The expansion of public education, the massive electrification programs that brought light and power and water, to the small towns and the small farming communities in the countryside. Those were extraordinary times, but they also set the stage for the first expulsion of many of our people, because they went not only to the urban areas like San Juan and others, they ended up on their journey in places like Nueva York, right? Like New York City, and, cities and places in the East Coast, essentially in the 1950s and 1960s, when the mass migration of our folks, came to many of these cities and towns in the northeastern corridor of the island. And so I learned many things. I learned the meaning of, inequality. I learned the meaning of justice. I learned the meaning of struggle. I learned the meaning of building power from below. I learned the meaning of solidarity and the meaning of community. As I learned, how to come together with other younger men and women of my generation, who began to understand the peculiar relationship of our homeland to the United States. By peculiar, peculiar institution that existed in the South, known as slavery, in our case, colonial. And it taught us that we needed to come together, to rally together in order to dream of the country we would like to build in our generation. And so, we began to build an anti-colonial movement back in the 1960s and the early 1970s. In my case, my parents brought me here to the so-called mainland, and I ended up in Bridgeport, Connecticut in the mid-1960s. And from there went to Hartford, Connecticut, which was the place where a lot of the agricultural migrant workers came to work in the tobacco fields in Connecticut. And so, I've seen a lot, I've learned a lot, and the most important lesson that I have learned is that if we want to achieve dignity and respect as a people, we have to come together. We have to be able to build, networks of solidarity and community, of mutual, respect, that meet people where they are, not where we would like them to be, where we think, that they should be. And that's, initially as an anti-colonial organizer, and then later when I came here as an organizer of workers, as a working class organizer, as a union organizer, campaigner, and educator. I have more than 5 decades of my showing their own dignity and respect. That's my story. I have my mom was a school teacher in the public schools in the countryside. She used to get up at 4 in the morning every day to prepare the breakfast and to take two públicos, two public cars. I don't know, something similar to taxis, but these were they drove many people, which is the situation in many of our countries south of the border. And she took two of those and got to her school up in the meaning people. And I see that our faces come and go and disappear in your broadcast here, but I hope they're still looking at us. So I learned that from my mom, who's no longer with us, from my dad, who was an organizer, and he taught me many lessons from my grandfather, who was this self-made small. I learned the meaning of the value of working hard, and building community and building wealth for the community, and also that we had a commitment to share this with the larger community, that it wasn't about individual appropriation. It was about the people that influenced my life, Brittany, and here I am, several decades later, in Planet New York City, as I call it, in El Barrio, in East Harlem, where I have lived for more than 30 plus years now.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing so much of your story with us. It's really powerful to hear. And, I think you touch on so many topics that I'm really excited to dig more into. One of them is, you've mentioned the term colonialism. And I think that that's really important because in this moment in particular, this political moment that we're in, I feel like we saw an uprising last summer, right? About racial justice. And we've seen real agitation because of COVID about economic justice, right? What does it mean to be considered essential, but to be not paid a living wage, right? Not given basic dignity and protections in the workplace, right? And we've had a couple talk about it Tuesday, speaking exactly about that, about labor rights and the ways that workers have been treated. But I'm also thinking about other uprisings that are bubbling up even in this moment, right? That we've seen Indigenous organizers standing up to stop Line 3 and the kind of, destruction and violation of treaty rights and their sovereignty as Indigenous nations on this land, right? On the so-called mainland, like you said. So we see that ongoing, which we have to recognize as a form of colonialism that we're contending with, right? That's the part of the conversation that we're having. We're also, there's articles right now talking about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And we have repeatedly violated Afghan sovereignty, right? And self-determination. We've been occupying Afghanistan for 2 decades now. And that's also a conversation about colonialism, or what we might describe as neocolonialism. And we're also seeing a discussion about Palestine and human rights and dignity and self-determination for Palestinian people, right? Which is also a conversation about colonialism. And so, I think when we talk about that, in Puerto Rico, we're also talking about a conversation about self-determination. And yet we use the language of protectorate, right? And so I'm curious if you feel comfortable sharing with folks, assuming people might not know much about the structure of how Puerto Rico is currently positioned, right? Share with us a little bit about the structure that currently exists and why it is correct, right? It is accurate to describe that as a colonial structure.
Of course. Many folks in the so-called mainland, as you know Brittany, discovered the existence of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans during the so-called natural disasters, the hurricanes that devastated the island. And they did not know that Puerto Rico was in fact a territory of the U.S., right? It's an unincorporated territory of the U.S., like others. And this came as a result of the Spanish-American War of 1898, in which Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines as war booties to the emerging empire at the time, which was this United States of America. And there are important links between the rise of empire and what happened with the institution of slavery in the South, which we are rediscovering these days as a result of this conversation that you alluded to. We are, many of us, discovering what happened to the land that was inhabited by the indigenous nations that were here long before the European settlers began to colonize, this country, and the expropriation of their lands, and what happened with the wars of aggression against Mexico in 1848, which resulted in more than 1/3 of the territory of Mexico being expropriated in what is today Texas, Nevada, Colorado, California, right? Oregon, Arizona, Nuevo Mexico. The history of the peoples of the Southwest, is a history of colonialism. It's a history of territorial expansion. It's a history of expropriation. And a lot of that, it was associated with the expansion of slavery as an institution. And it's not an accident that many of the men, particularly, that play pivotal roles, in the expansion of slavery, were also associated with the expansion of empire, because they wanted to expand slavery south, to places like Cuba, for instance, in Central America, Nicaragua. I mean, that's the history that's that's millions or 20 people, and some people press. And so in the case of us, those of us that hail from this island in the Antilles, in the Caribbean, called Puerto Rico, we have remained a colony since 1898. We are still under the sovereignty of the U.S. Congress. The fundamental decisions are, made by Congress, by the U.S. Congress. And there's no such thing as equality in terms of the application even of federal laws, that are, part of important social legislation that folks who are full citizens enjoy in the so-called, mainland. So, there has been a debate ever since those days about the question of the relationship of us as a people with this country. And now more than ever, it's become very evident because the manifestations of subordination and dependence are so clear, Brittany, that there's even a fiscal control board that was imposed as a result of a law that was enacted to create territorial bankruptcy, for Puerto Rico, given the fact that the government of Puerto Rico's public finances collapsed. The government owed more than $140 million to Wall Street banks and hedge funds. And of course, the debt, couldn't be paid. So, Democrats and Republicans came together and they enacted this territorial bankruptcy law known as PROMESA, the promise. And the promise, has not resolved the question of the dependency and hasn't resolved the question of the subordination. And so today, there is a growing debate about self-determination and decolonization, because once again, we are witnessing this everywhere, as you so eloquently described. And our, member of Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, our compañera, right, our comrade, has introduced legislation with the other senior member of Congress, a Puerto Rican woman, Nidia Velázquez, calling for a process of self-determination and decolonization for Puerto Rico that has triggered an important debate about this, solving this very question of the relationship, because there's also a group of folks in the island, as you know quite well, Brittany, that believe that the island should be totally integrated or annexed, as some of us like to refer to it, as a state of the union. Because they see it as achieving full equality and full civil rights and many other things. We don't share that view, obviously. We believe that first and foremost, the people of Puerto Rico have to make that decision themselves. Right. And I'm bringing this up because there are some folks who are, friends of ours, liberals, perhaps even some progressives, that associate the decolonization of the District of Columbia, right? The self-determination of the people of Colombia to become a state of the Union with the statehood of Puerto Rico, and they are two very different, things. Right. And so this is a very important conversation that we are having, Brittany, with lots of folks here in the diaspora, because it so happens, as you know quite well, that we, by virtue of just being here, we vote, right? We are not territorial American citizens like our compatriots in the island who cannot vote in the presidential elections or congressional elections. We vote, and we vote twice. We vote for them and we vote for ourselves. So we have to make sure that our voices are heard and that we insist that this is a choice that has to be made by Boricuas in the island, and I suspect in the diaspora, because many of us are going to want to participate in that decision. Wouldn't you want to participate in that, Brittany?
I do. Yeah, I do.
So
I do. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I because some folks, tell me, Jose, this is a decision for those of us who are, leaving the island to make. And I'm saying to them, Puerto Ricans are transnational people. The fate of Puerto Ricans on the island and the diaspora is one and the same. So the solution to the question of decolonization or colonialism in Puerto Rico has to be engaged by all of us, even those of us who are maybe, I don't know, what they call second generation, right? Brittany, or third generation. I don't know how those things are going to be defined, but I can tell you that there's a whole lot of folks in cities and towns throughout the diaspora that most definitely are committed to participating in that discussion. Give me some of that coffee you're drinking.
I know. I yawned and I was like, "Ooh, I need more coffee."
Talking. I saw you drinking coffee. Perhaps I come from the part of the island where coffee was grown.
Wow.
My grandfather. So coffee has a very special meaning for me, and it has to be espresso coffee. It has to be very strong coffee. I don't believe in tea. I believe in coffee because it generates energy and ideas and the expansion of the mind.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know that was tied to my roots, but we're the same in that way. So it must have to do with my Boricua roots. There's a couple things that, I definitely would want to be part of that conversation. And I believe that the diaspora, I think that a conversation about right of return and our role in relationship to our homeland is an important part of a conversation about what does it look like, how do we transition? What does a just transition toward true self-determination need to entail? And I think that that's one piece of it, right? And I think that the other thing, I want to back up because you said a lot of really important things that I want to make sure that people understand, because we are indoctrinated in this culture, right? Many of us are raised struggling, poor, right? Working class, whatever it is, whether we are genuinely poor, impoverished, right? Or whether we spent our lives living one emergency away from being impoverished, right? Which is many cases for a lot of working class people. We're taught to believe that our poverty is our own fault, right? Or that it's some kind of moral failing. And I think that applies to individual culture in American culture, but it also applies to the way that we think about structures and systems. And so I think what you mentioned, you mentioned ProMesa and the review board, what a lot of Puerto Ricans refer to as La Junta. I want to make sure that anyone who's watching really understands the history of this, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong too, because I'm still a learner on this. But, what happened is that Puerto Ricans are also, because they are within the sovereignty of the U.S. Congress, as you said, Puerto Ricans are not allowed to negotiate their own trade treaties and agreements. They're not allowed to make economic decisions for themselves that way, for ourselves that way, right? And so I need people to understand that structural fact, that reality, because that means that essentially the economic collapse that happened was engineered. It was by design, right? Yes. Because if you put in a position where you're not allowed to make economic negotiations and decisions for yourself, then it is not actually the fault. That collapse, that financial collapse, was not the fault of the Puerto Rican government or the Puerto Rican people, because they were not empowered to even truly make that decision. And so then for the United States to say, well, we're giving you this gift because we're helping you out of this situation, right? La promesa. But in exchange, because we're being the good guys and helping you, you have to submit to further oversight and control, is a situation that is morally bankrupt, right? And it's a misrepresentation of what happened, right? And that is, to me, the definition of kind of what we do sometimes, which is we set up this situation where we say, oh, well, they had a choice, right? They signed this agreement, they agreed to it, but it's not really consent. It's not really a free choice if you have essentially a gun to your head, right? If you essentially are facing death, if you don't accept that when that you found yourself in that situation by no fault of your own in the first place, right? And so I just want to make sure that everybody really understands that history and how Puerto Rico ended up in the situation that we're in now. And so now when we fast forward today, right? So now there's La Junta, the Financial Oversight Board, and that kind of oversight governance that has been put into place. And you know, I want to dive into some of the current issues that Puerto Rican people are facing as a result of that in the present, right? That are ongoing. And one of them was just in the news yesterday as labor leaders coming together because of the effort to privatize Puerto Rico's grid. And so I'm curious if you have anything that you would want to share about that, or, you know, kind of your perspective on that situation for anyone who's watching.
Of course. As a matter of fact, you know, Friday we had a gathering of multiple organizers in the island, convened by you know, many of the labor leaders. As you and I speak, Brittany, there is a gathering to form a broad base coalition which will be known as Todo Puerto Rico contra Luma, which is the privatizing entity that has now taken over the grid, as you called it, or, you know, the light and power and the water, as a result of all of these investment and privatization schemes that you so eloquently describe, which are the result of not having power, right? Because the power is exercised by, you know, in this case, the colonial power. And so there will be a very intense, a very sustained, popular struggle that hopefully will reveal, you know, the necessity of what we call energy sovereignty. Achieving energy sovereignty, just like it's critical for us to achieve food sovereignty, because we are totally, you know, dependent on the importation of goods and services from the so-called mainland, because we are a captive market, right? We cannot trade with any other sovereign nations and negotiate, you know, better terms with any other sovereign nations. So, you know, this economic subordination and dependence has consequences, and the consequences are further dependence and further subordination and further oppression, which manifests itself in all areas of the economy and society. So today, we're preparing to wage yet another fight similar to the fight we waged to oust, you know, the U.S. Navy of, you know, Vieques and Culebra, which were used as fighting, you know, range for the U.S. You know, Navy back in those days, as I'm sure you and many others participating in this broadcast are aware of. And so we are compelled once again by history to, you know, stand up for our you know, important, you know, fundamental rights, you know, essential services, as you know, they are described, you know, in many countries around the world. You know, the right to control your own energy resources, you know, your own water resources, your own food. I mean, all of these things are revealing themselves once again, and they will be the subject of a lot of news, Brittany, because this fight is not only going to be fought in the homeland, that is in the territory in the homeland, it's going to be fought right here in the barrios where we inhabit, and we are going to invite other allies that have been the subject or the object of colonialism here, other people of color, to join us in that fight because they know the meaning of colonialism, just like we did in the late 1960s and early 70s when we built, a movement in solidarity with sovereignty and and independence for Puerto Rico. We are going to compel our friends to join us once again in those fights, and hopefully Brittany Ramos will be elected to Congress so that she can become another voice, that fights for these things, just like Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and Velasquez are standing up for this fight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will be there, elected or not. I will be part of that fight because it's my fight. It's really all of our fight, because whether we are personally connected to people that we have all been impacted by colonization at this point, right? And I think whether we have, and we've been on different sides of it, but at the end of the day, it's important for me that we, I feel like that it's progress, that we be connecting all of these issues to a question of colonialism. And we be presenting our communities and ourselves and our government with the question of, do we believe in colonialism? And I'm here to say that I don't. And, I think that it's important to say that when I was raised and I was taught what is really often an inaccurate and almost mythological kind of version of American, the foundations of America, right? The formation of America. I was taught this beautiful version of it that was about throwing off the chains of colonialism, right? Was about saying that no government, no monarch somewhere across the sea should have the right to control people without their consent, without their buy-in, without their full rights and ability to have a say in that government. And, that was such a beautiful value I was taught growing up. And now I've grown up and realized that my own homeland is ongoing evidence that instead of throwing away that value, we internalized it. And we became instead the colonizers, right? We became the government that was ruling over people in distant lands against their will, without their full consent. And so I think that we have to have a reckoning, and we have to decide whether we want to live up to that beautiful value that so many of us were taught. And I would argue that we should make a decision to live up to that, and that we can, that it's possible, and that it's the right thing to do. And that, these ideas that are so often put in popular discourse about being a beacon of democracy and human rights, right? That this is part of that, that if we want to live up to that, if we want to actually live up to that dream, that vision, that this is one of the things that we have to reckon with. We have to reckon with the ethics, the morality, the principle of, being people who are ruling over, whose government is ruling over people in not just Puerto Rico, right, but in many places, in many similar island countries and beyond, through proxy in many cases, right? And so I'm so proud to be a part of this conversation, because I think that this is not just about the Puerto Rican people. This is about all of us deciding who we are and who we want to be, So, I'm
Absolutely.
so excited.
I mean, you yourself.
Go, please.
No, I was going to ask you because I'm intrigued. I love the way you frame and you characterize, the fact that the country was born as a result of a fight against colonialism, right? Against the British Empire, the so-called story of the 13 colonies, right? And I was intrigued about it because you yourself, were in the army of this country, and you I understand you were in a tour of duty in Afghanistan, if I have heard you before.
Yeah.
And you must have learned so many lessons about the meaning of empire and colonialism and subordination and dependence as you were engaged in this fight. Many of our veterans that fought in the wars like in Korea, particularly in Korea, more so than the big one against fascism, the second big war, the Second World War. Many of Puerto Ricans fought in Korea, as you know, and many of them learned some important lessons about the meaning of empire and colonialism. And when they came back, many became advocates and anti-colonial organizers. And then many more went to fight in Vietnam. And that was eye-opening in so many ways, as you know well. But I'm curious about, the Afghanistan experience because that is still lingering over the lives of people in this country. I do not mean to become the interviewer, but
no,
I'm just
it's okay.
just so intrigued to learn about the lessons that you learned from that whole experience.
Yeah, I think that the dynamics, the specifics of the dynamics are different because the history is different, right? But I think where there is such an obvious fundamental through line is understanding, and this is what I didn't understand when I went to war, right? When I was talking about this story, this set of values that we were taught, right? Those things build and build and build along with the present day kind of narrative that we're taught about the military, the U.S. military, and that we're the good guys and we're saving everybody, right? As I really internalized that. I really still was holding this origin story, right? Of we're the good guys who fought off the colonizers, and now we're this beacon of democracy, and we're protecting the people around the world to spread democracy, right? And so that was the narrative that I had not fully challenged yet when I went to Afghanistan. And I think what was most immediately obvious to me was the economics. I had not grappled with and I was not conscious to the economics of war. And when we think about colonialism, you'll also hear people talk about neocolonialism, particularly because, the distinction in my mind from neocolonialism to just colonialism is that neocolonialism often is economic control, even if it's not a literally overt political control, right? And so I think that, when we think about that, the through line, whether it's neocolonialism or colonialism, it is always in service of economics. And war has always been about economics. Every war, you tell me a war and I will point to how it had to do with economics. And there's this phrase in the anti-war movement that was popularized by incredibly decorated, also veteran anti-war activist, Smedley Butler, who said war is a racket. And that speaks to this point about economics, right? And he was saying war is a racket because it is always about a few people who are powerful making decisions, usually men, right? Usually historically, it has literally been a handful of men in a room deciding the fate of thousands, deciding that they're going to send thousands, if not millions, to go kill and die for their economic interests. And that is the best way to solve that problem, that economic problem. Right. And it's not to say that there weren't real economic concerns or problems. Right. But even when we think about dynasties and monarchies and empires of past, right? Whether you might say, oh no, it was about territory, but territory was always about economics in those cases, right? When we're thinking about monarchies, we're thinking about the coffers of the monarchies, the ability of the monarchy to control that territory for their plantations that they then put their, lower level ruling, dukes or whatever in charge of, to be able to, yes, profit and maintain the control of the monarchy. And when we see a situation like the United States, what we've seen is a movement towards an oligarchy in the place of a monarchy. Is corporations have risen, right, as the feudal lords. Essentially, they are, right, and it's no longer necessarily only about territory, but it's still about profit. And so when we think about Afghanistan, right, I've been in the I've been on podcasts and recently talking about my experience with the ways that the United States strategized around Afghan poppy and opium production, right? And the way that you literally had NATO and US troops guarding poppy fields. Arguably, the overt reason was to keep them out of the hands of the Taliban, but that it was still about, that's still a fundamental thing about economics, right? And then that ended up being, kind of that the answer, right, is like, okay, how do we make it legitimate, right? How do we make a trade like this legitimate? And that is almost always then to try to funnel it into the hands of multinational corporations. And those corporations we see in Puerto Rico, we see in Afghanistan, right? Whether it's defense contractors or other corporations that are just being able to profit in Puerto Rico or in Afghanistan because of the US and the NATO paving the way, right? And we see it all over Latin America in the ways that anytime there has been a government that rises up and says no, has the audacity to say no to a US multinational corporation, that government is quickly destabilized, and most recently overtly by our foreign policy. And so, I don't want to lose people. I know I'm saying a lot here. So for anyone watching, I just think that it's about understanding these connections, right? But fundamentally, whether it is about territory and geopolitical positioning for military objectives, those are currently still in service of economics, and they always have been. And that's the fundamental through line that I think that we have to reckon with. And I think that is why, I think addressing colonialism there's baked into that, right? And understanding that it has to come with a just transition and a new way of thinking about economics, right? That is not about brutal cooperation, competition, right? And control of these people who then you have executives who sit around and make billions and billions and billions while people are exploited, but it's about cooperation and what's good for the planet, because literally we will all die if we don't right? The pace of this is not, we're not going to survive it. And places like Florida and Puerto Rico and Staten Island even are already working class places that are seeing the brunt of the effects of that climate change already, right? And are not then prioritized for investment. So that, that was long, but I think it's such an important through line. And that was what opened my eyes, right? It started small. It started right in front of my face. Why are there so many defense contractors here sitting around making hundreds of thousands of dollars? Right? Like, why are our military mechanics literally not allowed to work on our own vehicles? Because there's a corporate contract that says only their mechanics are allowed to work on it, because that guarantees them more money, right? And so, starting to see that was the first entry point for me. The same way I'm sure for many people in Puerto Rico, right? Literally seeing these financial review boards be propped up, or the privatization of the grid as a supposed solution to Puerto Rico's disinvested, utilities infrastructure, is that first, right in front of, it's close to home, right? And then you start to zoom out, and you can see that through line across so many of these issues.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's why, we talk about the many dimensions and the many phases of colonialism and the many phases of the violence that colonialism generates. One of the other challenges that Puerto Rican society is facing is the increase, murder of women, gender violence, which is an explosive, catastrophic, challenge for many countries in the developing world, particularly. And Puerto Rico, is no exception to that. I'm sure you have been following, the horrible, stories of, of the murder of Puerto Rican women that now finally is beginning to get some attention from, the political class. Once again, because women themselves have organized, have built, these, networks of solidarity and resistance. They have compelled, those of us, who are males who claim to be, progressive, to stand up, next to them and to, fight. For transformational policies, knowing full well that the genesis of this whole thing, Brittany, is precisely colonialism. These are the many phases of colonialism. And that's why, we, in my generation, felt, the whole, and we, these movements. But now we see that as we begin to transition ourselves into, other stages in our lives, there are younger women and men and people like yourself who are rising up continue, this fight and this resistance. This is one of the reasons why I am so excited to have been invited by you to engage in this conversation, which is an ongoing conversation, and hopefully one that will continue, as you mentioned, regardless of the outcome of your own, congressional race, because I see people's rights. That is who I am looking at right now in this broadcast, whose name is Brittany Ramos, whose ancestral folks are back in that homeland, and so I feel that we need to engage our people, Brittany, in this conversation so that they can that come with exercising the franchise, citizenship, the rights of voting. Our people need to increase, their participation. In Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican voters have one of the highest rates of participation in elections anywhere in the world. But once we are here, most often not by choice, but by necessity, like many other migrants that are crossing borders around the world, something happens, to our political and civic engagement. And I suspect it has everything to do with the fact that many of us who are in public life, have not connected the dots, right? The way you were describing that what happened down there in that small town, right, which necessitated Juana and Roberto and Jose to come live no longer to New York City or to Staten Island, but to Florida and North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia. There's a rising, Boricua community in Georgia that we engage in the recent elections. That we need to present folks with real, meaningful choices that can impact and their lives in a transformational, way. And that is why I get so excited when I hear you, speak about many of the things that you're passionate about, Brittany. Or our friend Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who today was making statements in her Twitter account about the whole situation with Central American migrants when the vice president talked about dispersing some money to the governments of the region, and then she got up and said, "No vengan más, don't come anymore because you will not be welcome." Without addressing, the many generations of regime change and destabilization that the U.S. international agencies were involved in Guatemala, in El Salvador, and Honduras. These are the questions that you were talking about earlier in our conversation. And it's up to people like us to make sure that they are part of the broader conversation. Because if not us, who, right? Who will bring them up?
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And, we're going to continue to have conversations on topics that are related to this all week as part of our week of programming, celebrating Puerto Rican culture and struggle. In a kind of countdown to the National Puerto Rican Day Parade on Sunday. And so I hope everyone watching, I want to thank you for joining. Thank you, whether you're joining us live or whether you watch the recording later. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this important conversation and continue to share. I do think it's important for us to be talking about this, and join us for some of those other programs throughout the week. We're going to have some more exciting guests. We're going to be talking about some of those issues that you touched on as well, including around gender and colorism. And some of the social issues that we know continue to play out in our communities. And I'm so honored to really kick off our week of programming with this conversation, because I think that this is where we have to start. We have to start with history. We have to start with structure. And we have to talk about, and also, kind of the complicatedness of, the point that you made earlier, which is, any choice to be annexed as a state right now is with a gun to our head. It's not a truly free choice. And, no choice will be truly free until, the harms of the past have been addressed and the Puerto Rican people have been genuinely given the opportunity to get on our feet, govern ourselves, and, to come back into our glory as a people outside of, a colonial framework. So that has to come first. And so, Jose, is there anything that you want to leave people with in terms of next steps or organizations that you think people should be following if they want to stay involved or, continue to learn more on this topic?
Yes. One I made reference to, which is this gathering that is taking place as you and I speak, right at this moment, this coalition that will become known as Todo Puerto Rico contra Luma, the whole of Puerto Rico against Luma, which is the privatizing entity that has now taken over the grid, the light and power power and water. Farmers and people who are engaged in sustainable agriculture and in the solar energy and alternative, means of, energy and different cooperatives throughout the island, supporting organizations. I'm trying to think of the translation of autogestionarias, and I can find it in my head right now. But this coalition is known as VAMOS, and I will invite many of our viewers to follow VAMOS, which is playing a leading role in these many of these struggles that we there is a new a political formation that has emerged called Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana, Victory Citizens Movement, which garnered about 29% of the vote in the most recent elections, and elected some people to the General Assembly there in Puerto Rico, organizers like ourselves, who have become now fierce advocates for many of the changes that we have been discussing in this program. I'm going to make sure I share this with you, the addresses and the links, so that you can in turn share them with your viewers and many other folks, because this is about bringing people together, making sure that we build those relationships and those ties, so that we can stand up together, so that we can fight together, so that we can become strong together, so that we can achieve our sovereignty together and achieve our dignity and respect together. Thank you again, Brittany, for having me here today. I hope to be with you again in the not too distant future. And in the meantime, keep up the fight.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. The honor was ours. Thank you so much for taking the time, especially amidst all of this organizing that's happening. It was such a powerful conversation and really our honor. So until next time, we will definitely have a next time. And I will see you at the meeting tomorrow, and we'll continue to be in conversation. And for everyone watching, don't forget to make sure that you have a plan to vote in the upcoming June 2022 election, June 22nd, 2022. So June 22nd elections. Early voting starts June 12th, I believe. Make sure that you have your rankings ready. You have a plan. This is a very important election. And thank you so much for tuning in. As we get some of that information that Jose mentioned, we will make sure to continue to share it out. So stay tuned and make sure to join us for some of the other conversations we have scheduled this week. Take care, everyone. Go in power.